Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving deep into genetics. More specifically, how we inherit traits and how the environment can actually influence what's in our DNA.
Oh, wow.
You guys sent in some really interesting questions about inheritance patterns and the impact of multiple genes,
Hmm.
and even how our surroundings shape who we are. So to help us unpack all of this, we have an expert in genetics joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here. Genetics is such an exciting field, always new things to discover.
I bet. So let's start with the basics.
Okay.
I think a lot of us hear about traits being inherited all the time.
Right.
But what does that actually mean? I think it's a good place to start, especially given this section from the source material. LS.Bio.7, understand types of inheritance and how the environment can influence traits.
Okay, well, think of your DNA like a giant instruction manual.
Okay.
And each gene is like a specific instruction for building and maintaining your body.
Okay.
So inheritance is basically passing this instruction manual down from parents to offspring.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But our source material also talks about something called Mendelian inheritance.
Yes.
What is that exactly?
Well, Mendelian inheritance, it's named after the geneticist Gregor Mendel.
Oh,
It really focuses on how traits are determined by single genes.
okay.
And these genes can have different versions. We call those alleles.
Okay.
And these alleles can either be dominant or recessive.
So is it kind of like a light switch? Like you only need one on switch for the light to be on?
Exactly. So if a dominant allele is present, it will express its trait even if there's a recessive allele also present.
Ah,
So think of it as the dominant allele is like shouting its instructions louder.
got it. So for a recessive trait to actually show up, you need two copies of that recessive allele.
Exactly. Both parents would need to pass down that recessive allele for the trait to be expressed.
Okay, so that explains like those simple dominant and recessive traits.
Right.
But our source material also mentions this thing called non-Mendelian inheritance.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
Not all traits follow those straightforward Mendelian rules.
Oh,
So in some cases, both alleles can be expressed simultaneously, and we call this codominance.
oh, interesting. Do you have an example of that?
Yeah, sure. A perfect example is the AB blood type.
Okay.
People with this blood type have both the A and B alleles,
Mm-hmm.
and both of those are expressed on the surface of the red blood cells.
Okay.
So it's not a blending of the traits, it's a full expression of both.
Wow. So it's like having two like equally loud sets of instructions happening at the same time.
Exactly. And then we also have incomplete dominance,
Okay.
where the alleles blend their instructions. So imagine a red flower and a white flower producing a pink offspring.
Oh.
Neither allele completely dominates the other, and so you get this mix.
Oh, okay. So it's like they're compromising on the instructions.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
Now, let's not forget about sex-linked inheritance.
Right. That's where the traits are linked to the X or Y chromosome.
Exactly.
Our source material mentions that males are more likely to have color blindness.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, the gene for color vision is located on the X chromosome.
Okay.
Females have two X chromosomes.
Right.
So if one carries that faulty gene, the other one can often compensate.
Oh, okay.
But males only have one X chromosome.
Right.
So if they inherit that faulty gene, they'll express that trait.
Oh, that makes sense. So in a way, it's kind of a genetic gamble for the males when it comes to those sex-linked traits.
Yeah, you could say
And
that.
this is all super interesting. So our source material also gives some specific examples of genetic conditions and how they're inherited. And one that jumps out is sickle cell anemia. What can you tell us about that?
Sickle cell anemia is a great example of how a seemingly detrimental trait can actually offer a survival advantage in certain environments.
Wait, really?
Yeah,
How so?
it's a recessive condition.
Okay.
So that means you need two copies of the sickle cell allele to develop the disease.
Okay.
But individuals with just one copy of the sickle cell allele, they actually have increased resistance to malaria. And this advantage really helps the sickle cell trait persist in regions where malaria was a major threat.
Wow, it's amazing how like one single gene can have such complex implications.
Yeah, it really highlights the dance between genetics and the environment.
Absolutely. So our source material also mentions Huntington's disease,
Yes.
which has a totally different inheritance pattern. So
Yeah.
what makes that one different?
Well, Huntington's disease is a dominant condition,
Okay.
meaning that even one copy of the faulty gene will lead to the disease.
Okay.
And what's particularly challenging about Huntington's is it has a late onset.
Oh.
So symptoms don't usually appear until adulthood.
Oh, wow.
So this means that someone could unknowingly pass the gene on to their children, before they even know they have it.
That's heartbreaking. It really underscores the importance of family medical history, right? Like,
Yeah.
knowing your family's medical history can give you a lot of insight into potential genetic risks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Knowing your family's medical history can really give you a heads up about potential genetic predispositions. And speaking of multiple genes, this leads us nicely to polygenic traits.
Oh, yeah, polygenic traits. Our source material actually mentions those in this section. LS.Bio.7.2. Analyze and interpret data to explain how polygenic traits result in a wide range of phenotypes.
So now we're talking about more than just single gene traits.
Exactly. Polygenic traits are influenced by multiple genes, not just one. And you can imagine this makes things way more
I
complex.
can only imagine. So instead of like two options, like our light switch analogy,
Right.
now we've got a whole spectrum of possibilities.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great way to put it. Think about things like height or skin color, even intelligence.
Yeah.
There's so much variation in those traits, and it's because they're controlled by a whole bunch of genes working together.
So it's not as simple as like one gene for tallness and one for shortness.
Not at all. In fact, even a trait like height, which seems pretty straightforward.
Right. Is influenced by hundreds of genes, each with its own set of alleles. It's like an orchestra with all these genes playing a small part in the overall sound of the trait.
Wow, that's a lot to untangle.
Yeah.
Our source material mentions something called a bell curve distribution when it talks about polygenic traits.
Uh-huh.
What is that?
That's a great question. The bell curve helps us visualize the variation that we see in polygenic traits. So when you look at the distribution of a trait, like say height in a population, you get this bell-shaped curve.
So most people fall somewhere in the middle with fewer people at either end of the extremes.
Exactly. So most people are going to be average height, with
Yeah.
fewer people being very tall or very short. This bell curve shows us the variation we see in polygenic traits.
It's amazing how something like height can be so complex at the genetic level.
It is. And this complexity is even more amplified when we think about environmental influences. It's not just about the genes we inherit,
Right.
it's also about how those genes interact with the world around us.
It's that age-old nature versus nurture thing. Our source material actually mentions that environmental factors can change how our genes work, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Then that actually connects really well with this. LS.Bio.7.3 construct an explanation to summarize how traits result from interactions of genetic factors, multiple genes and or alleles, and environmental factors.
It really is amazing. So think of your genes as like the blueprint,
Okay.
but the environment is the contractor
Okay.
who determines how that blueprint is actually interpreted and put into action.
Oh, so you might have the genetic potential to be tall,
Right.
but if you don't get enough nutrients when you're a kid,
Right.
you might not actually grow to your full potential.
Exactly. And it's not just about nutrition. Things like stress, exposure to toxins, even social interactions can influence how our genes are expressed.
Yeah.
So it's this constant interplay between our genes and our environment.
So I see our source material has a section that says exposure to environmental factors may lead to different traits. Examples of variation and patterns and distribution of traits could include.
Right.
I'm super curious to dive into some of those specific examples.
Me too. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so think about identical twins.
Okay.
They have the same genes,
Right?
but if they grow up in different environments, they can develop totally different traits,
Okay.
different health outcomes, even different personalities.
So even with the same blueprint, the contractor can still make some changes.
Exactly. And it's not just in humans.
Hmm.
Our source material mentions the Himalayan rabbit.
Yeah.
These rabbits have a gene for fur color,
Right.
but how that gene is expressed actually depends on the temperature.
Really?
Yeah.
So their fur color can change based on, like, the weather.
You got it. The parts of their body that are colder, like the ears and nose,
Mhm.
will have darker fur, while the warmer areas will have lighter fur. It's like having a built-in color-changing coat.
That's incredible. I also see that our source material talks about how diet during development can actually determine the queen bee in a hive.
Oh, that's such a fascinating example.
Yeah.
It shows that even an organism's fate can be determined by the environment. The larvae that are fed royal jelly, they develop into queen bees,
Right.
while those that eat a regular diet just become worker bees. It all comes down to what they're eating in those early stages.
Wow, I had no idea food could play such a big role in their destiny.
Yeah, and you know what's really cool? It's not just the nutrients in royal jelly.
Okay.
Scientists think that there's a specific protein in the royal jelly that can switch certain genes on or off, steering that larva towards becoming a queen.
Oh, wow. So that's like a direct example of the environment affecting genes.
It is, and it really makes you wonder, What other hidden connections are out there? What other things in the environment are influencing our genes without us even knowing?
I know. It's crazy to think about all the factors that make us who we are.
It is, but it's also really exciting. The more we learn about genetics and the environment, the more we realize how interconnected life truly is.
Yeah, it really is amazing how much our surroundings can impact, which genes are turned on or off. It's like we're not just, stuck with whatever genes we inherit.
Absolutely. And, this raises some interesting questions about how our choices and actions might even influence our own health
Right.
and even the health of future generations.
Yeah, our source material has this reasoning section that kind of gets into those implications a bit. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really important point. If our environment can actually influence gene expression, then that means that creating a healthy environment for ourselves and others is even more important than we might have realized. Like, our choices matter, not just for us, but for the generations that come after us.
That's a powerful thought. It makes you think less about just understanding our genes and more about, how we can actively shape our well-being and the well-being of those around us.
Right. It's
Yeah.
realizing that we have some control in this whole nature versus nurture thing.
Mhm.
We can make choices that support healthy gene expression. Choices that, like, create a positive ripple effect.
This deep dive has been incredible. Thanks so much for sharing all your knowledge with us.
My pleasure. It was great to be here.
And to all of you listening, we hope this deep dive sparked your curiosity about the world of genetics and the environment. It's a field that's always changing, always revealing new things about what makes us who we are. So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and remember you're not just a product of your genes, you're an active participant in shaping your own story.